So if you're in the market for a new camera and you're looking at Sony's budget cameras, they're the more affordable line, especially their APS-C cameras, you're probably looking at one of two different cameras, the Sony ZVE10 Mark II or the a6700. Which one should you buy? Now, before the comments go crazy, I understand that there's a lot more cameras available. These are the two that we're talking about today because these are the two that I get asked about the most. People are very interested because the price point for these two cameras is so close and their image quality is so similar. Which one should they get? And there are a handful of differences that I think will probably help inform your decision. So we're going to go over those today. Now, as I said, the image quality out of these two cameras is borderline identical. I'll show you photos and video clips from each camera, but in my opinion, they're basically indistinguishable. It's really hard to tell which is which. So first off, I want to go over a few things that are the same in these two cameras. What are their similarities? What is it that they share? Firstly, they're both budget cameras. They're definitely on the lower price end according to Sony's sort of pricing of their cameras. We'll go over prices here in a little bit. First off, they both use the Z100 battery. This is a fantastic upgrade compared to the original ZVE10, which used the W50 battery. I'm very glad that they went with the larger battery. These can last quite a long time. For photography and videography. My wife and I shot a wedding yesterday and we used these cameras just to do some testing, and honestly I think we got through the entire day on one battery each. I think I used a second battery on one of them, but they last an incredibly long time. I've had no problems with those batteries, so really glad they put those in these cameras. Secondly, they are both using the Sony E-mount, obviously because they are Sony cameras, and they both have APS-C sized sensors. That just means that the sensor is a little bit smaller than a full frame camera, which has a couple of effects. Nothing too major, if you're, but it basically means that the image is slightly more cropped in, and you kind of get a little bit of a less blurry background depending on which lens you're using. But a lot of that is up for debate, and I have a whole video on that up here, so check that out. Another thing that they share is that both of them only have one SD card slot. The SD card slot goes on the side of the camera, which is much nicer than the old ZVE10 that you had to go into the battery door. I always hate that. But they both have one SD card slot, so if that's a big problem for you and you need two, you're going to be looking at a much more expensive camera. But there are a handful of differences between these two cameras. First off, price. The Sony ZVE10 is $1,000. I think that's with the kit lens. However, I actually wouldn't recommend getting the kit lens in my opinion. If you have the budget for it, I'd highly recommend get a decent couple of primes or maybe a bigger zoom. But that's my 2 cents. So $900 to $1,000. The a6700 can be found between $1,300 and $1,400 depending on the time of year, depending on if there's any sales going on. But the really nice thing about the a6700 that we're going to get into in a little while is that there are a lot more of these on the used market. You can get some really good deals on this camera used if you're willing to shop and purchase used camera equipment. So price is a little bit different. Obviously the a6700 is a little bit more expensive than the ZVE10 Mark II, but the question is, are the upgrades and the additions that you get with the a6700 worth $200 to $300 more than the ZVE10 Mark II? So here's what you're getting for that extra $200 to $300. You're getting a few more buttons. Okay, so on the body itself there are a handful more customizable buttons, which for some people is a pro and some people is a con. If you're just looking for real simplicity, you're just getting started and you don't really want to learn how to use the camera full manual mode, well then you might just want to stick with the ZVE10 because it is simpler, it's easier to use, less buttons, and it's more designed for beginners. The a6700 though has a lot more buttons that go onto it. It's got some customizable buttons, it's got a full mode dial, and a couple other little things that are just really nice to have if you like to dial in your settings a bit more intentionally. So for me, that's a huge bonus. Now, a couple other things that this a6700 has that the ZVE10 Mark II does not are things like a viewfinder. The a6700 has a viewfinder. It's not the most amazing viewfinder in the world, but it is a viewfinder. It's pretty good. And if you need one, if you're a photographer that likes to use the viewfinder rather than just relying on the screen, which can be very beneficial if you're in bright sunlight or stuff like that, where you kind of want to be able to focus in like that, then that might be a make it or break it thing for you. Personally, I don't use viewfinders very much because I'm more video than I am photography, but I know to a lot of people that is a much bigger deal. So if you need a viewfinder, the ZVE10 Mark II is not going to be for you. go with the a6700. Secondly, the a6700 has a mechanical shutter in front of the sensor. What that means is basically whenever you're taking a photo, there is a piece of metal, a shutter that closes and opens in front of the sensor, exposing the sensor to a certain amount of light and capturing your image. The ZVE10 kind of is obviously able to take photos as well, but it does that electronically. There is no mechanical shutter inside of the camera. Now, some people might see that as a pro because there is a thing called shutter shake, which I've never experienced, which is basically the idea that motion of the shutter opening and closing could, in theory, move the camera a little bit. But I've never experienced that. If you have an example of that, please let me know. But I've never seen or experienced that happening. Personally, I would much rather have a mechanical shutter than not have one, because at least in this camera, you can turn it off and you can use the electronic shutter and go silent. Whereas with the ZVE10, you can't turn on the mechanical shutter because it's non-existent. Now, having a mechanical shutter is much more important to photographers and videographers. If you're a videographer, this doesn't matter because you're not going to use your mechanical shutter anyway. But for photography, what the mechanical shutter can do is it helps with motion, which is sort of like helping with rolling shutter, and it can help with sort of banding, that sort of light banding that happens with certain types of lights. Now, in saying that, there are workarounds. Okay, the rolling shutter in the ZVE10 Mark II isn't actually very bad. I just saw a clip of a guy used it for some motorsports photography, and he's taking photos of cars going over 100 miles an hour, and you wouldn't know that there were, that he was using a camera with no mechanical shutter, because modern day cameras are doing a whole lot better with dealing with these problems. And if you have a problem where your lights are flickering or banding in your image, the best thing to do is just change your shutter speed. Change it to 1/60 or 1/125 was what worked for us majoritively when we were taking the photos yesterday, because banding was a big problem. So all we had to do was just change our shutter speed. There are workarounds for these things, but to some people, they really like to have the mechanical shutter. Again, this is something you just have to decide, is this important to you? Now, the third, and in my opinion, the most significant difference between these two cameras, and one of the reasons that I would highly recommend the a6700 over the ZVE10, is that the a6700 has an IBIS system built in, which means inbuilt image stabilization. That means that the sensor is on like a little stabilizer. So if you shake the camera a little bit, or as you're walking, the sensor gets moved. It means that the IBIS system inside the camera is going to try and help keep your footage nice and stable. Now, it's not the best stabilization in the world, right? There's much better stabilization out there, but it's nicer to have some stabilization than none. So again, as a video guy, or if you're a photographer looking to do some sort of longer exposures, or you're doing some more low light stuff where you need to have a lower shutter speed, having that inbuilt stabilization is really, really handy. And the last thing that this has that I think is also, again, a fantastic upgrade for the a6700 is that it has their newer AI autofocusing chip. The ZVE10 does not. So technically the autofocus is better in the a6700. Now, that doesn't mean that it's bad on the ZVE10 Mark II. The autofocus is fantastic on this camera, but it is better on this camera. So again, that might be make it or break it for you. You have to decide that for yourself. And I think for the money difference, I do personally think that it is worth it. So granted, image quality is the same in these two cameras, but with the a6700 for just $300 more, I think you're getting a pretty substantial upgrade. But ultimately, the question is, for $300 to $400, are the upgrades and the differences of the a6700 worth it over the ZVE10 Mark II? And in my opinion, again, this is just my opinion, you're welcome to yours, and do leave those in the comments down below. But in my opinion, the answer is a resounding yes. Honestly, if the only difference was IBIS and the AI chip, I'd be happy with the a6700. I've seen these go used for $1,100 relatively frequently on eBay or Facebook. So for a $100 difference between these two cameras, I think that this is a fantastic upgrade. Getting the EVF, for those who like to use them, the mechanical shutter, the inbuilt image stabilization, and the better autofocus performance, and all of the better buttons and dials that come on this camera compared to the ZVE10, I think really make this, in my opinion, Sony's best budget camera. And I would recommend it to anybody looking for one. Now, in saying that, if you're really wanting to save some pennies, you're wanting to try and buy the best image quality that you can get for the lowest amount of money possible, then the ZVE10 Mark II will do you just fine. It is a very good camera, it's very capable. Again, the image quality is fantastic. And if you can get around the differences or the shortcomings of this camera, then I think it's going to be great for you. You're basically getting an FX30 standard of image quality in a $1,000 camera, which that's hard to beat. And I would be recommending this a whole lot more if this didn't exist. But I think that the upgrade between these two cameras I do think that this is far more worth it, especially if you're willing to shop used. So I understand for a lot of you that maybe getting a $1,000 camera over a $1,300 or $1,400 camera, is far more valuable, in which case I don't think you can go wrong with this camera. The most important thing about any camera is not the camera itself, but it's the person behind it. Learn your craft, learn how to be a better photographer, learn how to dial in your settings, take better photos, practice, and do your best. And it doesn't matter what camera you have, especially nowadays, all cameras are amazing. So use what you can get your hands on. But that's my 2 cents on these two cameras. I want to know what your thoughts are. Let me know in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video, do hit the like button, drop a comment, or maybe even subscribe as we continue to build this channel. I appreciate all of you for doing so, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.